We have to do a little review if you forgot what proximal and distal means. So proximal, again, if you're talking about a central object, so this is what it means, like distal would be away from that central object. So here we're in terms of like gross anatomy and surface anatomy. Distal would be away from the torso and center of your body, whereas proximal is the opposite direction. So proximal would be toward the center of your body. So again, distal is and proximal, in layman's terms, they can be thought of, distal can be like away and proximal can be like toward. So these are two important terms because we're going to be talking, these terms are used when we talk about the nephron. And so what we have here, so there's another related term as well. So there are these two terms called afferent and efferent, or afferent and efferent. But I'll say afferent and efferent to make it a little more clear. So when you have an afferent, that's also a word that can roughly mean towards something as well. So what we have are afferent arterioles that lead toward the structure called a Bowman's capsule or glomerular capsule. And what's happening here is that now you're at that glomerulus. So that glomerulus is they are capillaries, just arranged in a different tangled form that's not like our typical capillary beds. And then from the glomerulus, you have these arterioles that lead away from the glomerulus. These are called efferent or efferent arterioles. So just like our afferent nerves and efferent nerves in the nervous system, afferent is like saying it's towards something, efferent is carrying away. My mnemonic for that is A before E in the alphabet, so A going toward, E is away. So what happens is that the blood filters in this Bowman's capsule, and actually when you have this structure of the capsule and the glomerulus itself, all together they're called the renal corpuscle. So this is where blood starts to first do the first steps in forming urine. Now the glomerulus plus so the renal corpuscle is that. And so what happens is blood is filtering through this renal corpuscle, and now it's going to enter something called the proximal convoluted tubule. And why is it proximal? Well, again, remember, proximal is like saying it's toward or close to a central object. So the part that's actually close, the part of the nephron, that the renal tubule that's closest to the renal corpuscle, that's why it's proximal. It's closest to the original start where you're starting to filter out blood to make urine. Then we might be like wondering what convoluted means, and if you look up in the dictionary and it says like convoluted means having convolutions, it's like, oh, that's really helpful, right? But what does convolution mean then? So convolution is something that has that curved or tortuous winding. So tortuous means like you're kind of like bending these into different shapes. So that's what you have with the nephron. Even though I'm showing it as like a winding snake-like path, like a lazy river, actually with that previous picture we saw with it kind of like, shoot, do I have any sort of cord or like your any sort of headphones, like when you pull it in out of your pocket enough and it starts getting all tangled up like that. So that's kind of like what your nephrons are. The tubules actually end up all tangled up and winding like that. All right, so convoluted tubule meaning that it just has a lot of winding and bends and turns. Then it ends up from the proximal convoluted tubule or PCT, then you end up in something called the descending limb. So again, descending means going down, but where is it going down into? It's going down into the renal medulla. It's actually going down more inner toward the inside of the kidney. So this is where the descending limb goes. And it goes, that's the first part of what we call the nephron loop, or loop of Henle is a common name for that. I think you should definitely know both because nephron loop, pretty obvious, but loop of Henle always refers to this. That's a really common name too. Then what's the opposite of descending? You go ascending, so now you're coming out of the renal medulla and going back into the cortex. And then you end up with the distal convoluted tubule. So both of these parts surrounding the nephron loop, they are convoluted, but it's not, again, remember that when we saw that previous picture, it's all mashed up together. The proximal convoluted tubule and distal convoluted tubule, they are in the same neighborhood. So that's why it's kind of hard to say whether one is like superior, inferior, lateral, medial. That's why they use proximal and distal. So what makes it proximal and distal? is it close to the renal corpuscle or is it further away from it? So this is the part that's closest and the first part that comes from the renal corpuscle, and this is the last segment of the renal tubule that's coming away from that's most distant from the renal corpuscle. In terms of flow, how like the path that that liquid takes through this renal tubule. And again, so the renal tubule, what's the difference between that and the nephron? So the nephron refers to the renal corpuscle, so this part right here, plus this entire tubule. So again, the renal tubule refers to the PCT, the loop of Henle, and the DCT over here, whereas the nephron refers to the renal corpuscle and this entire part right here. And then you end up at a collecting duct, and remember that there can be multiple nephrons leading to the same collecting duct or system. All right, so then we have our collecting systems, and so again, the PCT and the nephron loops and DCT, well, this is trying to make it a little more accurate, but when I used to do like a drawing exercise with this in class, what I would have them do is draw this kind of like, yeah, the typical squiggly line structure we had in the previous example, but I would actually have people fold their paper. And why did I have them fold their paper? As a reminder that the DCT and PCT actually overlap, or they don't intersect, but they're located next to each other. And another important concept is that the DCT actually comes close to the renal corpuscle. And why is that? Well, as blood flows through here, or not blood, but fluids flow through the renal tubule, it changes chemical composition. And the cool thing is that the composition of the fluid over here, that can affect whether these tubules over here, the afferent and efferent arterioles, they can actually adjust the blood flow to say, okay, maybe we're making our urine a little too dilute. Maybe we're making our urine a little too salty. Let's adjust the blood flow to the glomerulus and based on the final product that's ending up in the DCT over here. So that's the interesting thing, and why your nephron loops upon itself multiple times is that it's always doing these kind of like little checks on its own composition of the fluid inside the renal tubule and trying to make adjustments so that you're not secreting too much water, you're not secreting too much electrolytes. Because again, the main function of your urinary system is to maintain the chemistry of your fluids in your body. All right, so then we have our collecting system over here, and again, remember, multiple nephrons can lead to the same collecting system.